I'll let Bishop Andrews introduce himself, and then we can start a little bit with our discussion tonight.
Well, first thing you need to know, I was going to ask Steve the first question, which is, why am I here? And you heard a little bit about it, and that was that we were doing an icebreaker with the faculty and staff. And it was just a kind of how well you know another person. And the question that they asked the faculty and staff about me was which group of books I preferred, Lord of the Rings or Narnian Chronicles. And so I said that Lord of the Rings. And on that basis, Steve intuited that I was an expert on it and asked me to be here. So, I am Stephen Andrews. I'm the principal of Wycliffe College. I read the Lord of the Rings first time when I was a teenager, and then I read it again when my wife and I were in Cambridge, and I was doing doctoral work, and we couldn't afford a television. And so every evening we read novels, and we made our way through the Lord of the Rings. And then probably 10 years later, I read the series to our daughter. I subsequently discovered that Tolkien thought that you shouldn't read the Lord of the Rings until you were 17. But she was about 11 or 12, and I was just asking her about it before this evening. And she remembers weeping when Gandalf fell with the Balrog. But, yeah, we all did. Anyway, so that I'm a great fan of it. I'm not an expert at it, but...
Yeah, I hope we can have a fun discussion. I think like bringing up C.S. Lewis and Tolkien is a nice entry point because a lot of people don't realize that the Lord of the Rings actually does have kind of Christian roots to it, whereas Narnia is more explicitly allegorical. And so, yeah, why do you think it is that for some reason, like, it's a little bit obscured for Tolkien, and maybe what the importance of that or what Tolkien's kind of purpose was, in doing that?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, that Tolkien was a devout Roman Catholic. I think everybody knows he was very formed by the liturgical life of the church and the theology of the church. And I also think that what he produced in The Lord of the Rings was consciously designed to trade on perennial theological themes having to do with things like divine providence and free will, and the titanic struggle between the rule of God and those who are opposed to the rule of God. But because of his own, and he understood these dynamics in the development of ancient sagas and the Northlandic material that he read, that there is this kind of deep theme, this kind of archetypal theme that works its way out in all of great literature. And I think he wanted to be faithful to that and to develop this own story that would lead people into that world.
Yeah, as I was kind of reading for this week, I found one quote where it talks about in his writing process he wrote, and then in his editing process he purposely removed any explicit allegories that he thought were too overt in The Lord of the Rings. And so he wasn't trying to de-Christianize it, but he had this idea that there's something beyond he talked about like it's more parable-like than an allegory. And so he had a real vision for how literature could extend kind of imagination, in Christian thought. And so, yes, it was kind of interesting to see, I guess we, as we kind of try and share kind of a message, a Christian message, like what can we learn from those kinds of principles? Like if we want to pit C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, like there's two kind of paths. What are the strengths or weaknesses of those kind of pathways of
expressing Christian ideas.
Yeah. I was wondering about that too. I was thinking about how attractive, fantasy is for people, and why it is that people can more readily accept, some of these kind of more metaphysical ideas in the world of fantasy than in their own worlds, and also whether or not by creating this fantastic world, whether or not that might be an impediment to the way people sort of read the Christian story or read, the book of Revelation, for example, which is a very kind of fantastic, account of the end of things. And of course, the Lord of the Rings itself has this kind of eschatological drive that has lots of parallels with the book of Revelation.
So people may not know, but you were the research secretary for John Stott for a couple of years. Did he ever talk about Lewis and Tolkien in the time you were there? And
everybody was very keen to know whether he'd ever met C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
He had met C.S. Lewis, but they weren't friends or anything like that. He was never a student of Lewis's. And occasionally he does, I think in his writings, kind of refer to Lewis and some of Lewis's ideas. But I would never have called him a fan of The Lord of the Rings or the Chronicles of Narnia particularly. Yeah.
So for you, kind of when you're reading the Lord of the Rings, like what characters do you identify with, and who do you think really kind of brings some of those Christian ideas, to the fore?
Again, I think that Tolkien was self-consciously modeling, some of the characters on kind of biblical archetypes. I think there are parallels between Aragorn, for example, and the Davidic kingship. I know my wife loves Sam, of course. Who doesn't love Sam? But this somebody raised his hand. Somebody doesn't love Sam. This humble simpleton who ends up being used in the purposes of, this providential, working out of this plan is really quite wonderful. The whole turning upside down of the humble becoming great in the story. Those are fabulous characters. Frodo himself is a really complicated character, but this struggle that Frodo has within himself in terms of his, let's say, relationship with Gollum, who initially he feels repulsed by. Bilbo has preserved Gollum's life when he could have killed Gollum. Frodo makes this observation, but then there's something that happens in Frodo's experience where he develops this sort of sense of pity about Gollum himself, which sort of demonstrates, that Frodo sees the same kind of compulsions within himself that has driven Gollum along his own path of self-destruction. So anyway, so Frodo's a really exceedingly interesting character for me.
And do you feel like the story and how it unfolds, like what does that kind of tell about kind of maybe an eschatological frame, like of how Tolkien at least envisioned the kind of world or reality unfolding? How does that kind of play into the narrative, and how does that narrative reinforce kind of his understanding of that?
Well, I think he really is taken with describing this struggle between the forces of evil and the rule of God, and one of the most engaging parts of the whole narrative is the way that it's out of the unexpected, the weak, the injuries and sufferings of this little band making its way to Mordor, become the instruments of the overthrow of Sauron. And so I think there is this sense that Tolkien has, that we underestimate the way of God's work in the world, and that and we have our own sort of images of the struggle between good and evil, but it's just too kind of black and white the way we sort of think of it in the Marvel universe, for example. But no, for Tolkien, he understands that the ways of God are not the ways of humanity.
Yeah, and I think there's a sense, like, you definitely get the sense that, like, there's this seemingness of, evil dominating to some level. Like, it's out of control or God is absent, at some level, but there is that kind of, kernel, maybe it's like incarnational in a sense, like there's that small kind of seed that's kind of making its way through that creation in order to redeem it, at some level.
Yeah, and Gollum is the example there. It seems to me, because Gollum does become the kind of sort of agent of the final sort of act of the ring's destruction, and so this business of Gollum's preservation throughout the story is quite remarkable in a way. I mean, when everybody wants to kill Gollum, including Sam, it's Frodo that preserves him. Anyway.
Getting back to this idea of allegory, the other really interesting thing that I read this week that I'm still wrestling with to some degree is one person pointed out that Tolkien had said that he didn't like allegory because it puts limitations on thought, and he wanted to create a world which was an extension of kind of like that revealed world that Scripture gives us, and in that the writing actually releases the ability for people to create and imagine as like kind of sub-creators, and allegory is actually really dangerous for us because it puts limitations on the extension and growth of Christian thought, beyond kind of, what has been told to us now. So do you have any thoughts on like that kind of concept? Like, part of it, I really like it, but then part of it is like, it seems dangerous, at the same time. Like, what are the limits maybe of that? And, but, yeah.
Well, I think it's true that, I don't think Tolkien ever wanted his story to become an allegory, because there is a kind of correspondence there, and he wasn't about that. He was simply creating this world, which may have resonances with our world, but which is also kind of delightfully, in some ways, free from the constraints of our world. This whole sort of panoply or menagerie, if you will, of creatures really resembles, in some respects, the kind of cosmology of the Bible, with its intermarriage between elves and humans, and different categories and hierarchies of ancient peoples and such. But on the other hand, I wouldn't want to say that means that it couldn't be used sort of allegorically. And I think people can often diss allegory when they think that it's just an unprincipled way of using one description as a way of meaning something else. And you hear this often among evangelicals when they talk about the use of allegory and allegorical interpretation of the Bible. But that's not really fair, I think, to the allegorical period of interpretation, the great period of the patristic writers, because their readings were very controlled, and they were very controlled by a supreme kind of way of reading Scripture. St. Augustine, in his work on Christian doctrine, he talks about how to read the Bible. And he says that allegory, and he uses allegory in the most kind of fantastic ways that don't make logical sense to us, but what he's doing is he's using scripture to elucidate the fundamental principle of what does it mean to love God and neighbor. And so I think that there is a way in which one can use stories like Tolkien, as long as it's governed by a kind of Christian principle, a way of understanding these things and drawing, moral insights and truths. I think Tolkien himself was aware of that, and he was very reticent or reluctant, and in fact more than reluctant, he rejected any attempt to apply his story to say that it was an allegory of the war, for example. So anyway, I think the use of allegory can be appropriate in certain circumstances. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was trying to think of like a modern example. In some ways, I was talking to Justin, our theology prof, and he was talking about how Van Hooser had this whole thing where it's like Revelation's like the script, and we're like kind of acting it out. But I wonder, in some ways, is Tolkien's view more of an unfinished manuscript in a way? Like some has been written, and then the end, we know what the end chapter is, and there's a little bit of freedom in between to extend Christian thought in between and kind of create in that space that's anchored kind of in the tradition and in the revelation, but there is more freedom. So it's kind of like, I guess, Romeo and Juliet when Leonardo DiCaprio's kind of modern adaptation. It's not like that, but it's something like, you've got the start of the movie, can you finish it? And I think maybe Tolkien's vision was like, hey, there is an opportunity to kind of explore this space and extend it within kind of the guidelines that have already been established, whereas Lewis Moore maybe was a Romeo and Juliet 1995, remake. So for those who haven't seen it, it's pretty good. So.
Yeah, I mean, Tolkien was a philologist, sort of schooled in early English literature and such. And I heard David Lyle Jeffrey, who's I think now retired professor of English at Baylor, who used to teach in Ottawa, and he specialized in this kind of medieval Renaissance period. And he said he once described what was going on in the medieval mind is that that the story of humanity was the story of God writing a book, and that human beings are sort of words sort of pressed into the pages of time, and put together they don't make any kind of syntactical sense and grammatical sense. It seems like a jumble. You might be able to make connections here and there, but the problem is that there's no verb, and in good classical style, the verb always comes at the end of the Latin sentence. And of course, the verb is the verbum, the word of God. And that the person of Christ, who, when Christ, enters time again at the end of time, it gives meaning to all the narrative that comes before it. And I think that that's very true of the way that Tolkien understands the narrative force of his, or direction of his novel. Yeah. There are some things that we can't make sense of.
Yeah.
I don't think. Like, has anybody ever made sense of Tom Bombadil? I don't know.
Comic relief, maybe. Comic relief.
Well, it could be. But,
yeah. Or maybe that's the purpose.
Not an important figure in the story.
No.
And he wasn't in the movie. So.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think the kind of enduring qualities of Lord of the Rings are that they've kind of spanned, many generations? I know you've alluded a little bit to it, on these archetypical themes, but like, what is it about, I guess, like in an age of kind of empiricism, where, we live very kind of lives that are governed by, very materialistic, ideals in some ways. Like, what is it about fantasy or this kind of genre of literature that is enduring, even in this kind of a very kind of empirically based society?
Well, I'd like to hear the audience talk about that. I mean, I think that there are people who, and I remember them in high school, who were sort of so taken up with the world of Tolkien that, not only when the Silmarillion was published did they sort of read it cover to cover. I always had a hard time getting through that. But,
Yeah.
But they went, so far as to kind of learn the language, and all. And there is that kind of, I suppose, escapism that is quite wonderful. And it's, quite wonderful to escape into a world where you think that the world, as, as painful and as cataclysmic as it is, does kind of come good in the end and make sense in the end. And yet there still is kind of mystery, but it's a mystery that holds the promise of something that's good.
Yeah. Yeah, this week I found a really cool essay. I can't remember the title. It was like stories about fairies or fairy stories or something like that. It was written by Tolkien. It was an essay, and he talked about like the three kind of important pieces of these stories. And one was recovery, like it recovers something true about kind of our reality. Escapism, like you say, it has that escapism, and then consolation. There's a kind of redeeming, quality holistically to these things, and that's why they persist, in such a powerful way. But we want to have an opportunity for the audience to engage a little bit as well, and so we have a mic that Terry's got.
So my comment was mostly about Gollum and Frodo. Isn't a large part of the sort of Gollum's story is a redemption story, and then Frodo's first of all, being empathetic with Gollum because he's going through the same struggles, feeling the ring's corrupting powers, and for him, hoping that Gollum can redeem himself is giving him hope that he can redeem himself afterwards as well. And then I don't know if I'd call Gollum redeemed, but his final act has some redemptive qualities.
I'd be interested in hearing you sort of describe the redemptive quality. I do know that from the very beginning, when Gandalf is talking about Gollum, he talks about, it's almost like there's part of Gollum's soul that's still sort of... Good, yeah. And he talks about it like a little chink of light, coming into his soul.
Smeagol, as it was shown in the movies?
Sorry?
In the movies, it was portrayed as Smeagol, his alternate ego.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah. So where is the redemption in the end for you?
Simply that without his intervention, you couldn't have destroyed the ring at the end. So he's basically inadvertently sacrificed himself for the good.
Right.
Be the redemption, I think.
Right.
And I think like at some level, he was the most corrupted, by the power of the ring, right? Like, so even the most corrupted can be redeemed at some level,
But did it redeem him? I thought, didn't it destroy him?
Yeah.
Was it altruism that caused him to bite off Frodo's finger and grab the...
No, I said inadvertent redemption is his sacrifice, but it wasn't him consciously sacrificing himself, but still that action had a good outcome.
Had a redemptive, yeah. Right, yeah, yeah. Which is a demonstration of this kind of supervening power that Tolkien never names as God, but is very much evident, I think, throughout.
So you're saying it's more a cause, like it's divine justice, like this is the end path of his corruption was being burnt in the lake of fire. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That was kind of my take on it, but I'm happy to be corrected.
All right, this is a theological conversation, right? So, eagles, Deus ex machina, go.
There is a lot on TikTok on that for sure, of like, why couldn't they just fly the eagles there and finish it off? But yeah. Like, why not? Or
What is it? Which I guess which is it? Is it providential or is it Deus ex machina? People are pretty unsatisfied with the eagles. You've seen the cartoons.
yeah, I would say that like the fellowship's journey was divinely guided. Like that, there was a sovereign kind of path that this was going to happen, and so the eagles don't, even though it's extraordinary and supernatural, it's inevitable, in that sense. So
I think I would agree. I think that the eagles, even though they are the sort of instruments of this kind of amazing sort of rescue, at the same time, I think they're still agents in the service of something greater than themselves. So in that respect, I don't know how kind of ex machina they are, but yeah.
There's a lot of TikTok videos on like, why didn't they just fly the eagles all the way there and cut out the rest of the show, but
You're saying about Golem and sort of him taking a place in sort of the providential order of Lord of the Rings, along with the eagles, that they're sort of subordinate to something inevitable, which I think there is sort of your kind of eschatology, as it were, like that Sauron is already kind of defeated, he just doesn't know it yet. And that seems to be kind of the Christian and parallel there. I don't think that's reaching too much, but I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, the other question too with that is like, how providential, is the evil itself too, right? In Tolkien's world, is it?
Well, yeah, right. How providential it is, and also kind of it, how evil is manifest. The ring itself seems to have a will, right? It's derived in some respects, I suppose, from Sauron, although Sauron is also kind of driven by the ring, right? So
yeah, I think that's part of why that story is so great. It's evil isn't just embodied in a single villain, right? Like it permeates and it bubbles up and it disappears for a bit, and then I think you see that in the Rings of Power too. Like, I don't know if you've watched the new series, but like just the I think it was in the first or second episode where it was just like the marks of Sauron, are just, they find them in the weirdest place and they're like, oh no, it's still here, even though there's no evidence that he's still, like, I don't know, how long was she hunting Sauron for in the new, like a few hundred years, like trying to like find him because she never believed he was actually dead and everybody else has given up. But then they find the evidence that like, oh no, it's still there under the surface, And so I think that really resonates, that, like things can appear good, but there's always that possibility kind of that can pop up.
Yeah, and I also think that there's a kind of moral lesson Tolkien's telling there too, right? That we deceive ourselves. We're naive if we think that we have, absolute control over, ultimate control over these things. And I think Sauron is himself, a figure that kind of warns us against ourselves.
Yes, I was just going to say, in reference to Gollum, I think a big part of Frodo's sympathy comes from just seeing that that's what he could have become, as especially the closer he gets to Mordor. But the other thing I just wanted to mention about the eagles, it's more evident in the books that the eagles are kind of off to the side, that they will intervene if they want to, but that they don't sort of, a little bit like the Ents, in the sense that they may respond and get involved, or they may not, and Gandalf describes the eagles at one point in that way, and I think that's, sorry, get a little feedback.
Tilt the mic a little bit away from the north.
Sorry?
South. Tilt it like this way, yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Anyway, just one more comment, just that I think, back to what you were saying about the constraints of allegory, because Tolkien hasn't constrained himself by allegory, he can have those kind of characters that are sort of maybe a little bit more aloof to humanity's plight, whereas with, say, the Narnia Chronicles, once you've established that Aslan is Christ, you have really boxed yourself in. He can only do certain things at that point, whereas Tolkien has given himself a much bigger palette to play with. So you have these characters that are sort of, well, Tom Bombadil is one, but they're sort of like, you can't necessarily predict what they're going to do. And so that's what those TikTok videos probably come from, people who really just watched the movies and said, well, the eagles were there all the time. Why didn't they just carry them there? But that's to not understand where Tolkien, what the role was of the eagles in the story. So,
And I think you bring up an interesting point too. I think different than Lewis, it's Tolkien. It's not about the humans. You know what I mean? Like it's not like in some ways like it's the universe is much bigger and it's more like it's more complex. And I think the Lewis, you definitely have it centered on kind of a human story, you know, about humanity. Whereas Tolkien's like, this is God's universe, like you say, a bigger palette, you know, in a way. And so, yeah, maybe it's an interesting idea to like say like it brings us outside of our own kind of perspective, in a sense, like God's doing something, you know, bigger, and there's more players and actors involved, even ones that, you know, tangentially interact with our story, you know, like the eagles, you know, or something like that. So.
Yeah, I would like to, hi, I'm Martin, by the way. I'd like to add just like, there's Nazgul and they can take down eagles. So maybe that's like one of the big things. And they weren't actually taken care of at that point if you just flew them all the way over. But also, I'd like to talk about some of my favorite characters, or some of my favorite relationship between these two characters, Boromir and Pharamir. And I like just how different they are as like characters, where Boromir is more like, we can use this ring, we can use this power that he thinks that he can control in evil. And in some ways, like how humanity often, they think that they can use violence as a mean to defeat evil, like for good. But often, like, you know, violence begets violence. And then how Faramir is a good, I guess, foil or opposite of Boromir, and how he himself is tempted by the ring, and he's often like kind of overlooked because, you know, he's a younger brother and his father evidently hates him and can't eat tomatoes very well. But anyways, like Faramir, like he actually has this beautiful relationship with Éowyn. Wait, is it Éowyn? Yes, Éowyn. And so the movies don't talk about this as much. Maybe in the extended versions, they just have like glimpses of scenes of that. But there's a scene where he's in the House of Healing with Éowyn, and he's using like the Ethelus plant, or the plant that uses to like heal. And then there's actually a romance that kind of develops through like a few months. And I don't know, there's something about when Tolkien's actually writing about that, where you actually see the more healing elements of the world at that point. I don't know if you guys saw that, and because the movie doesn't depict it very well. About that.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. Yeah, I think that's definitely true, I would say.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought a lot about that, Martin. I think that's really interesting. Certainly, in the, sagas of, Icelandic sagas and such, the natural world is a really important part of the working out of the tale. Is it the Finnish Kalevala has got some kind of fruit that sort of finds its way up the leg of a maiden, and she becomes impregnated by it, and many sort of interpret this as a kind of sort of story of the Virgin Mary, so investing the kind of natural world with with supernatural sort of capacities and meanings is, I'm sure is probably there.
Yeah, I think I just saw some themes of like Aragorn also using this plant. So like Aragorn as almost like an archetype of Christ, and he actually provides healing for this world, not just like divine justice, but that there's like a fuller kind of reconciliation that kind of happens.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, a large part of when Aragorn ascends to the throne after the Battle of Pelennor Fields was partly because they had a prophecy, I think, at that time, that the king would have the hands of a healer, which is part of why he does that throughout the story. Also, talking about Faramir and Eowyn, would you say that there's a contrast as well between sort of Faramir was a bit of a reluctant warrior who almost died in battle, and then Eowyn was kind of a over-enthusiastic person who almost stowed away to fight, and then she also realized how horrible war was, and then they're both bonding over that as well.
Any other thoughts? Oh.
I've been trying to think through how in a lot of the works that we use to draw theological conclusions, the ones that seem to work the best are often less explicit, as we've been discussing. I'm wondering, though, if at the end of the day, even the best Christian, not parallels, but stories that lead us towards the gospel, if the universe always ends up being just deistic, because of the particularity of the gospel that can't just be played out in the same way, because we already have a Christian story. So when we have stories that point to that, do they actually functionally end up being deistic?
Well, and this is maybe Trent's point in some ways, right? Like, is it providence or intervention? And I think, yeah, like, would you say that Tolkien's world is deistic? Like, this is just a whole bunch of secondary causes happening, like with a teleology, like there is a purpose to it, but, the God is absent, and he's only operating through agents that maybe aren't directly under some commands, but are operating under their kind of pre-programmed
I'm sure that's probably the case. I mean, I have to say, I've never met anybody that told me they just finished reading the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I shouldn't say trilogy, but the Lord of the Rings story, and decided to give their life to Jesus Christ. Not that that's impossible, but having said that, it does, reading it, it's very hard not to sort of think that his understanding of human nature maps very much onto, the book of Romans, for example, or letter to the Romans, and, the sort of mixed nature of human will, and the kind of fallen part of who we are as human beings, as well as this kind of larger eschatological sort of reality. So there's a sense in which it's not that, you know, the thing about this sort of world of the deists is that there really isn't any kind of influence, really divine influence in the workings of the world. You know, it's the watchmaker God idea, right? And you know, lets itself kind of run itself down. But no, this is a story where there are, you know, where the force that is controlling this narrative is, you know, entering into the story and changing the direction of, you know, of the characters, and introducing new characters in such a way that it just doesn't work out that it happens by sort of either some strict formula or by chance, it seems to me.
Yeah, and I think at some level, from what I read, is that Tolkien would not want to be constrained by having to paint a theistic interventionist God. Like his purpose was to expand other realms, and I think this is part of the dangers that he felt like when you start to constrain yourself to making sure you have like a beginning, middle, end every time, and it's like why Christian music is bad in some ways, right? Like it's just like it feels forced and contrived, and I think he was trying to get away from that to be like, this is an opportunity to kind of explore and expand, you know, these ideas and these concepts in a way. Yeah, and like I guess, you know, you look at parables that even Jesus taught, you know, like they're not complete in themselves all the time, and maybe if you only had that one picture, you'd misconstrue who God is terribly. But holistically, as a whole, they do paint. So does that mean like? And I don't think he was trying to say this is the complete, you know, understanding of God or reality or whatever. It was a story that extends parts of it in ways that. Anyways, that's how I kind of think. But I think you're. Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea to think of like how does that constrain, and can you ever, without an explicit allegory like Lewis, ever get to kind of a gospel, like an interventionist kind of incarnate. I don't know. Is that kind of what you were getting at? Yeah.
And I don't think it's like, you know, Tolkien was saying, okay, you know, there's these great Christian stories from the Bible. How am I going to sort of
fit them in?
Tell the stories again using, you know, this kind of mythology. I don't think it was that. I mean, I think he did believe that, you know, that you know, a lot of these ancient sagas were actually rooted in themes that were essentially Christian in their nature. It's sort of a bit like, you know, Lewis talking about his study as a young classicist, and himself discovering the you know, the Icelandic sagas, and finding himself in tears over the, you know, the appeal to Odin, for example. Why is that? Well, there's something about, you know, this human need to sort of be connected to some kind of transcendent being and purpose, and somehow the beauty of the saga elicits that in human beings. And I think Tolkien used that to great effect in his writing.
Well, I think we're gonna wrap. We're at 8:30, but we have more beverages here, and we want to invite you to keep the conversation going and meet some new folks. But I'd just like to thank Bishop Andrews for being our guest tonight. And maybe we'll organize a watch party for those who haven't seen The Rings of Power, you know, over the next couple months. So, but thank you, everybody, for coming out.
Thank you.